Thank you for joining us for Data Privacy and Informed Consent. I am Sarah Johnson. I am the person in this room who knows the least amount about this topic. But I am here with two experts, Sean O'Connor, who is our Chief Information Officer of Perceptics, and Melanie Stopek from Citibank. I'll let them both introduce themselves. But what we're going to talk about today is what is the law, what are the regulations tell us, and then Melanie is going to walk us through a real-life example of how this issue was addressed at Citi and some of the challenges that they faced. This is probably one of the least sexy topics in the whole world of surveys. However, as Melanie reminded me, it is one that if you get it wrong carries a very large and painful financial penalty. So it behooves all of us to get it right. So one bit of housekeeping, we welcome questions. But please let me get to you at the microphone because we're recording the session. And unless you talk into the microphone like this, which I haven't been doing, unless you talk into the microphone, your question does not get recorded. All right? So I'm going to leave it to Sean and Melanie.
I was going to grab your microphone, but I guess I don't need it. All right. Well, welcome to this, and thank you for coming off of the sunshine-filled lawn to enjoy this wonderful topic. I'm Sean O'Connor with Perceptics, and Melanie's with Citigroup, and we'll be talking about privacy. And then she will have like the most interesting what can go wrong sort of example with doing the privacy when you let the lawyers get involved, so to speak.
Can you please moderate your expectations now? Because that's not what I'm going to be doing. Okay.
All right, so jumping right in, this is an interesting little map of the world, and the red is kind of areas with heavy legislation. I don't know what color you'd call this, maybe salmon or something like this, is more of it's still strong, but not as like intense as some of the US or EU-centered areas. Yellow is kind of burgeoning. They're starting to increase their awareness of privacy laws and how they're dealing with the data, sovereignty rights, et cetera. Or maybe they'll have one and not the other. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. The ones in gray, we either have no data on at this time or they're just very, very nascent. So looking at specifically these countries, we see that there are about 100 countries that have data protection laws in place. 58 have really intense legislation, and those are the reds and the salmon, or whatever color we want to call that. Obviously, the leading one there is the EU with Gdpr, which is, as we all know, kind of the gold standard, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. However, the US also has a lot of laws going on. Some of that is HIPAA, where you're dealing with health information. Some of it is centered on minor children, where we want to make sure that their information, if you're less than 13, is protected. However, states have also jumped into the bandwagon. So we have Washington, California with the CCPA, and then other countries like Australia, China, Russia. They, though, have more of a bent of who owns the data as much as like trying to protect the data. Brazil, Ecuador, Kenya, Thailand, these are all countries with they're moving towards a new set of legislation. It's still being modeled. A lot of it's being based on the GDPR. For instance, Brazil's LGPD, not to be confused with LGBT or something like that. 21% have no legislation at this time. Algeria, Egypt, Afghanistan. We won't even talk about Venezuela. They may not even have a president right now. Or electricity, running water, anything like that. And 12%, as of the time of this study, had no data associated with what laws they had in place. I have the study. I can share it with you after the fact. You can see all the gory details. It has links to what laws they have in place. You can read about it, share it with your legal team if they don't already have it. We can get into the details there. So, the GDPR, obviously it's the 500-pound gorilla in the room, so to speak. And we've all probably been having to deal with it for about 3 years or so at this point, getting ready for it, the culmination of it, here it is, and then what's going to happen after the fact. And now the fines are starting to come out, and we're starting to look at what's going on there. So with the GDPR, first of all, they gifted us with hundreds of, maybe not hundreds, but lots of new acronyms. So we've got data protection authorities, data transfer agreements, data protection officers, data subjects, registry of rights, data processing activities, you name it. We've got all sorts of different terms. And of course, primary and central to these are controllers, which is you as an organization controlling the data of the data subjects. So whether it be Citigroup or NXP, you're going to be acting as the controller that owns the data subject's data in this context. You're basically controlling how the data is going to be used. Then the next big component are the processors. And the processors are working for you as controllers, and we're processing that data on behalf of the controllers. And in this case, obviously, it's going to be survey specific. Then underneath the processors, we can have sub-processors. So if the processors need help doing something, then we would bring in a sub-processor. For Perceptics, at this point, we don't really have any sub-processors, but unless you have some translation components that we'll need to bring in some translation experts to help translate your questions or something like that. For the consumer, obviously, what has GDPR done? It's strengthened their rights. Now they can say, look, this is our data. We want to know how you're using it, where you're using it. We want to make sure that it's accurate. We want to be able to inspect it at any time. For regulators in the EU, what has it done? It's kind of homogenized the law so that all of the law is the same throughout the member states, so that if you're an Irish Data Protection Authority or an English ICO, you know, well, English for now, UK, we'll see what happens there with Brexit. France with CNIL, they all know that they can prosecute the same law because you're all part of the EU member states. And for businesses, what has this done besides make our life much, much harder to deal with all of this data? Well, it's basically made us be more accountable to the data so that we know when and where and how it's being used, and we have to demonstrate that use at any point in time. So let's, and of course there are some big fines, which I know Stephanie and some others were talking about. So let's dig into the data and the actual specific elements. The first is that we have to process personal data fairly and lawfully. First of all, that means that there has to be a legal basis for dealing with the data. The legal basis can be one of 6 items. For the most part, it's going to be legitimate interest or consent. And there are other legal bases for processing the data. Some of them are like vital interest, but I don't think that as much as managers would like to say that it's in your vital interest that you participate in this survey, I don't think we can use that. So my first big tip of the day is try to get your legal departments to use legitimate interest as their legal basis instead of consent. Consent should be used as a last-ditch kind of garbage bin sort of, we don't have any other legal basis off of which we can, and I know you're going to talk about that in a little bit.
I'm going to pass out in a second. So what you're saying.
But try not to use consent if you can. And big caveat, I'm not a lawyer, I can't give you legal advice. You need to work with your legal departments and your privacy departments, and I know you all have them. But it should be a conversation and not just, well, let's back up and say, right, between lawyers and HR, we're very risk adverse, and probably nothing's going to be happening if we just cave into that. So instead, we need to make this a conversation where we say, what can I do? Can I operate under legitimate interest? And if so, that's the way to go, because if you operate under consent, the problem there is that you're creating a large administrative burden, because consent can be withdrawn at any point. So if they give their consent for the survey, they can later say, I would no longer give you that consent. Please take out my survey results. And then what does that do to historical trending? You're going to have to pull it all out. So big problems. Okay. Let's wait, because I know Melanie has amazing stuff. Just write it down so we don't forget about it. And I don't want to take away from her thunder, and I don't know how long I'm going to take.
There is no thunder.
Second big point, process the data for the specific and lawful purpose for which it was collected, and not further process the data in a manner incompatible with this purpose. So, obviously this can be a bunch of different things, but the thing that immediately comes to my mind when I think about it in a survey-specific context is, do you want your data to be included in benchmark reporting? Which is something that I hope all your organizations would like to do. And obviously, Perceptyx has a benchmark database with, I think, over 8 million respondent data points in there. And we would like all your data to be trended in there historically as well. But under GDPR, we're not going to be able to use that EU data as part of that historical database unless, as part of the contract, we specify that it's one of the lawful and specific purposes for which we're collecting that data. Point number 3, ensure that the data is adequate, relevant, and not excessive in relation to the purpose for which it was processed. Survey-specific information, obviously I think demographic information, right? Like what sort of PII do we need on the survey? And do we have to include it, or is it just a nice to have? I think obviously as businesses we want as much data as possible to just load in there and see if that's the critical variable upon which we can pivot and say that this actually turned it. We didn't even think that years of tenure was important, but it turns out it is. Obviously that's going to be an important one, but I'm just talking. Keep personal data accurate and where necessary up to date. So controllers are responsible for the employee's data, and you all as employers will, especially in the HR function, will be making sure that this data is accurate and up to date and making sure that we have the most recent information. For Perceptyx and dealing with Perceptyx in terms of doing the survey, what this means is that we'll need to make sure that we have that most frequent and up-to-date information as well, which means sharing it with us either via an HRIS system API or via flat file downloads that we're synchronizing. Specifically, one of the big caveats is that when it comes to survey invitation, we should make sure that the emails are all accurate prior to sending them. User access requests are going to be going to the controller, usually, not to Perceptyx. However, if you need some help with that, then we can make sure that the user access requests and change and inspection of their data can be handled through us as well. All right, this is another big one. Only keep personal data for as long as it is necessary. Now, in survey-specific information, I would say benchmarking, historical data. How long are we going to keep this data? And I would just say 5 years. And I know all of your organizations are going to have different thresholds, different information. External benchmarks, I know there was some talk yesterday about de-emphasizing external benchmarks, but internal benchmarks and training over many years is very important. But I would encourage all of your organizations to have a threshold set ahead of time saying, this is how long we're going to keep the data, and then just eradicate it on a rolling basis after 5 years so that the 6th year drops out and you're not responsible for that information. Process personal data in accordance with the rights of the data subject. So this is going to enter into Melanie's talk and what she's going to speak about in her cautionary tale, as it were. But this is all what we're talking about. On the front page of the survey or the end of the survey, somewhere in there, we need to give the survey respondents a notice page. We're going to say, here's how we're going to be using your data. Here's what we're going to do with your data. Here are the reports we're going to run with it, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't need to be 500 pages long or somewhere around there, but it does need to say what exactly it is that you're going to do with the data. One of the core tenets is transparency and accountability of GDPR. And if we're operating under those specific instances, that'll be very helpful. So on that, one of the things that we as a survey company want to say is the notice page should specify will that data be coming back to the organization or not? Because the survey respondents need to know, is somebody at the company, our company, going to be able to see this data as well? Or is it purely confidential and it's only shared with Perceptics and it's going to be protected under the reporting umbrella with minimum thresholds such that my data is never going to be seen? So that's one of the things that we should be very clear in the notice page before we launch. This one's all about putting technical and organizational controls and measures in place. Basically, this is about the controller's responsibility to make sure before they select a processor, and this doesn't have to just be Perceptics doing your survey, but any sort of processing that you're going to have done for the data, you need to ensure that they have technical controls in place, that they're going to be able to keep the data safe and secure and private. It used to be only that everybody only cared about security. But now with the advent of Gdpr and some other privacy-related things, there's this privacy component too, and sometimes we think, well, what is even this privacy? And privacy is all about, well, if security is about controlling access to it, privacy is about who can have access to it and why are they having access to it. And so it's just part of the due diligence, risk review, governance process to ensure that everybody's has some sort of basic level of competence, and Perceptics, of course, is ISO 27K and SOC 2, et cetera. Finally, we need to ensure that the data that's present in the survey is going to be inside of the EEA or is transferred outside of the EEA to another country that meets these minimum burdens, and they call them adequacy, right? So does a country have adequacy or not? Japan recently established adequacy with the EU. Some very small countries like Uruguay have adequacy. However, the US does not have adequacy. So we have to be very careful there that when we're transferring the data. What happens there is that there's a very small law called Privacy Shield that interacts with the EU and says, if your organization is Privacy Shield certified, we'll carve out this very small little bit and allow you to also have access to that data. Another point in there is that you can choose to have your data either in EU servers or US servers. Most of our clients use US servers.
Sean, can I ask a clarifying question?
Uh-huh.
So on the certification of Privacy Shield, is
Yeah.
that the appropriate term to be?
Yeah, there's some sort of certification process to become the Privacy Shield.
Is that for the controller and or the processor?
It's whoever is going to be moving the data outside of the country. Okay. Yeah. In this case, Perceptics is definitely Privacy Shield certified.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, so
Okay, so this is A Tale of Two Cities, which is sort of before GDPR and after GDPR. And Sarah, I was thinking it has more relevance, and I'm thinking of Sydney Carton and a far, far better thing I've ever done than I've ever done before by agreeing to do this session. So thank you very much. So what's the context for us? So Citi has a long tenure running surveys. We've been running a citywide global survey for 20 years. We've never missed an administration. So even during the financial crisis, we've administered the survey every year for 20 years. In 2010, we instituted a demographic question around sexual orientation. And clearly it was a self-identification question. It was not something that we pulled in from any of our data fields. Moving forward, over the next 6-7 years, we added 6 other countries. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, and I think the last one escapes me. In 2018, and we really started to think about this in 2017 when we were adding all of these countries around sexual orientation, we have very strong affinity networks within Citi. And in the fourth quarter of 2017, our CEO made the decision that each of his direct reports would co-chair an affinity group. And that They needed to look at data. They needed to understand what actions needed to be taken to create this inclusive work environment. So both to increase representation and to create a more inclusive environment. And that's why when Janet earlier talked about, representation is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, the thinking was that the best way to find out whether or not people were being asked to dance was through our VOE survey. So in January 2018, and we had started this slow process of adding countries, the chairman of the LGBTQ affinity group made an announcement citywide that every country in the world would now be asked self-identification of their sexual orientation. If I would have been eating, I would have probably thrown up at that point of time, and I was actually in the town hall session when he made the announcement. So unbeknownst to him, did not understand the difficulty in making that happen. But when he happens to be the president of the firm, makes a pronouncement like that, suddenly there's a lot of people that need to get involved and to look at self-identification from a sexual orientation standpoint. The complications for us is we were also in the process of transitioning to a new vendor called Perceptics. We were with our prior vendor for 17 years. There were concerns raised about social norms in certain countries where it's not legal to publicly be or to say that you are, so how can we ask this question? Did we really want to do that? There were regulatory issues that were emerging in India. There was the Gdpr, and we weren't really sure what it meant. There was a lot of ambiguity around it and what personally identifiable information was required. And so we didn't really know what it meant to be compliant. And so with all of this happening in January 2018, I made the wise decision to delegate the responsibility to someone on my team and to step away. So I am not the expert in this process. I admit that right away. So it takes a village. So that's sort of what we learned in the process. And it took a village with people meeting weekly. So we involved people from our survey team, not including me, global talent and diversity. Obviously, our diversity team at the corporate level was very involved and wanted to make this happen. We have a global compliance group that got involved. We had employment law involved. Missing is sort of information security, who was also involved. We involved all of the country HR officers, of which we have 110, but we agreed to focus on 94 countries initially, and not on the 110 countries of which we operated, and regulators. And you might say, but why should it take sort of a year to get this done? Because nobody is waiting for us to call them on the phone and to basically say, sure, go ahead, ask these questions. And in some countries, the regulators didn't speak to them for 2 or 3 months after we initially contacted them. So we asked, and this was also different for us, we asked every country HR officer, compliance and law officer, to provide clearance. And there's really 4 elements that we asked for clearance on in parallel. So one is we asked the items on the survey. And the items on the survey have never been an issue for us, except maybe with the works councils, so the unions in Europe. We then asked them to approve or provide clearance for all of the fields that we send through our HRIS system, such as who your manager is, what your job class is, what your level is in the organization. So we asked for clearance on that. Then we asked for the core basic questions that we've always asked, that were not new in 2010, that we've asked always. And we could take this information from our system, but to get a sense of our culture, we ask people. So we've always made the decision for employees to self-identify what their sex or their gender is, or what their age is. We could pull it from HRIS. We've always made the decision that for those types of questions, we rather it be clear that it's voluntary for you to provide that information to us, not that we're going to take that information. And then the last piece was we suddenly had additional demographic questions related to sexual orientation. For the first time, we asked about gender identity. So not just gender, but gender identity. And we asked about disability. And in the past, we had only asked about disability in the UK. So this was all new. So we asked the regulators to provide clearance on sort of these 4 separate buckets. And what happens is when you ask for clearance on 4 separate buckets, you get clearance on separate buckets and not necessarily on all the buckets at once. So for all of the people that we gathered together and we met weekly, we realized that we really didn't know what we were doing, to be honest. It was sort of like a journey into the unknown for a lot of the people. And this 20 million euro fine was standing over all of our heads. We were like, no. Like, okay, do you want that to happen on your watch? Do you want to be in the New York Times because you were the first company that was called out for this? And as you know, as a financial services organization, we are highly regulated to start with. In 2008, we were the poster child for everything that was wrong in terms of the economy and the largest bailout in history. So I did not want to be a part of any future news moving forward. So I would say we chose to be conservative. Now, what's interesting is that our compliance officers would say, we were not compliant in our approach. We were transparent in our approach. And that is the distinction. We wanted to make sure that employees were clear as to what we were doing with the data and what data we were capturing, and that it was all voluntary. So that was the change for us. So rather than to say that we looked at these laws, we're not really sure what they mean, we're going to take a very conservative approach. Instead, what we communicated to employees is, we have a promise and a commitment to you that if you don't want to give us this information, you don't have to, and this is what we do with the information. So make an informed choice whether or not you want to provide that information to us. So all of these types of questions around what laws are applicable related to sexual orientation. Is it legal to ask employees to self-identify in a survey? What we learned was it might be illegal in Singapore to be out as LGBT as part of that community, but it's still legal to ask a question on a survey. And remember, we're not telling people that they have to answer these questions. It's voluntary. And so the next question, a number of the people who were the key stakeholders said, but isn't that culturally insensitive? Like, we're asking people questions that it's not even legal in those countries? How would that make you feel? And our chairman was very clear that we want to create an inclusive environment, that you should be allowed to bring your whole self to work. And as you know, a survey is a two-way communication vehicle. And this is an approach that we support across city. And that was sort of the mandate that we had from the top of the house. If allowed to ask, what is the notice and consent process and the withdrawal process, what Sean alluded to, where will the employee data be stored, is there a time limit? What was interesting, based on what was happening in India, and we were actually down to the wire, so we really started going full force in January. We administered our survey in the middle of September. Until September 1st, there were still 3 countries that were outstanding that wound up participating. India, at the last second, agreed to participate if after 90 days we would remove their demographic data. So that's what we had agreed to do. So we had to report who had access to the data, how the data would be used, how it would be reported. So where do we land? So basically, as I alluded to, if it was not illegal, we asked all of the demographic questions to all of the countries that we got approval for. That was 39 countries. So our effort to get 90 countries on board failed. We got to 39, but they were our largest countries, so it represented 83% of our population. Singapore, Malaysia, and Argentina were also down to the wire. Actually, I think a week before administration. We were ready, but we were ready to pull the plug on them as well if they opted out of the process. Because of the fact that we asked for clearance on all 4 of those areas, 15 of our countries where we always ask for gender declined. So we lost gender information on 15 countries that we had previously. And Algeria, Slovakia, and Luxembourg did not play at all. They chose to be very difficult countries in the process. No, because I did not have the interaction in those particular countries. It was very interesting because particularly in Asia, in China and Singapore, for example, we have this ethics lens that we talk about, which is the good, the right, and the fitting. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. And good is it good for all the stakeholders? Right, is it legally permitted? And fitting, does it fit in with the culture? And we had people raising the issue and actually talking about it in comments that it might be legal, but was it really fitting based on our culture to ask these kinds of questions? So I'm not really sure what happened there, to be honest. I was a little bit removed, and we relied on our legal folks on the ground to talk about it with the regulators. We wound up having 7 different variations of the consent form, so that wasn't easy either. The regulators demanded different versions, and I'm going to share with you what the US version looked like. The biggest battle was right here. So previously at Citi, we asked for the demographic information first. So you would go into the survey and we asked for you voluntarily to provide your demographic information. My concern was, so our legal and compliance people said, well then the consent form has to be the first thing that people see. I was concerned when I looked at the consent form that we would have nobody take our survey. And in conversations with our compliance and our legal people, I said, do we need the consent form for people to take the survey or only to provide their PII information? And I was told, no, it's only the demographics. So I said, given the fact that we don't have this issue everywhere, and to establish a common practice across the firm from a consistency standpoint, why don't we then have people take the survey, put the consent form at the end of the survey, and then have the demographics, so at least the survey experience is consistent across the globe. They couldn't come up with a reason why we couldn't do it, so that's what we wound up doing. We made the decision, which was also something, honestly, I fought against, to include the consent everywhere, whether it was legally required or not. So for example, in the US, which represents 45% of our population, I thought there was some risk in terms of non-participation. Why would we add the consent form in the US if we didn't have to? And again, our philosophy, which is I think the right philosophy in the end, which is why are the people in the US not entitled to that same level of transparency as they are in the rest of the world? We will be consistent and we will standardize the process everywhere and take the risk that it will lead to some non-participation. Okay. So this is what the US consent form looks like. I know this will be available after, so I don't really have to highlight, but we're more than happy to share it. I think it took about 35 lawyers to agree to the US version, and I'm probably underestimating. But the first piece was generally what we used to provide to employees before they filled out the demographics. So that was not new. So in advance of filling out the demographics, this is typically what employees saw. The notice was new. The consent was new. What you don't see here is that employees have to formally consent. So there was a button that said, I consent, or I do not consent. I choose to skip I choose to skip ahead or skip the questions. Okay. What percentage of employees do you think did not consent globally? 5. Anyone else? 15. Anyone else? 37% did not consent. Now, what's interesting is HR was very involved in this process, knows what we do with the data. What percentage of HR employees do you think did not consent to the process? That to me was the most fascinating number altogether.
Did they know what the demographic questions were going to be as they decided to consent or not consent?
They're all here. They're all there.
Yeah.
So they knew what they were consenting to. Now, what's interesting, what's related, what you might find interesting, is that the big focus for us was on sexual orientation, right? But we would have had to do this for all the demos anyway, but the sticking point really wound up with the regulators around sexual orientation. So almost 40% of the population skipped the sexual orientation question. If I take sexual orientation out of the equation, that just said I choose to skip, that was 37%. But to give you an idea where the sticky countries were, what you see is in the Asia region, so almost 52%. But if you look, NAM mostly represents the US because we have very few employees, in Canada. So 40% in the US, it was actually I think 38.5, chose to skip. Prior, because we had all this data before in the US, right? Like I said, we've been doing it in the US since 2010. There was nothing new in the US. It was 8.5% was the skip rate previously to the sexual orientation question. So it jumped from 8.5 to 38.5%. Yeah. Well, yes, did I look at particular sort of breakouts in the US to see if there were individual groupings where it was more likely that people, it was general. There were no issues. But what was interesting is 162 people withdrew consent based on that consent form. We didn't even make it clear how you can find where to go after you took the survey. So we were like, how the hell did these 162 people figure this out? But they were able to withdraw consent. What was interesting, 733 people consented and answered none of the demographic questions. They just wanted to see them. Okay? Now, in India, where we had a big concern, the skip rate was 52%. In Singapore, it was 59%. And in China, it was 48%.
So it sounds like you're asking for consent before the self-identified demographics.
Yes.
But you are also sending demographics over from your HR system.
No.
None. It's
None
all
of these
somebody-
type. We don't
None
send.
of these type. But you are sending some demographics
Right,
over.
manager.
Don't you
tenure.
for GDPR need to get their consent on that?
I
And
don't
then
think
what
that's
happens
considered
if-
personally identifiable information, was my understanding.
No, well, it depends whether it's coupled with something
Right.
else or whatnot, yeah, but
Right.
you could still be operating under legitimate interest for that portion of it.
Right.
Oh, legitimate interest.
Yes. They use single sign-on to take the survey. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I don't understand what's required from a GDPR regulation for an employee to consent, because I was told by Perceptics we have to have a consent form at the beginning of our survey, and we're not doing any of these kinds of things. So
We
that's
were
something
told
to
by our
take
lawyers
offline.
we were not. So again, like I
So
say, this is like,
probably depends on that.
We call it a
Consent
consent and
versus-
notice page. The verbiage kind of gets a little mixed up there, but what's required is notice, not necessarily consent, but it depends upon what you as a controller are operating under as a legal basis.
Okay, thank you.
okay, so sort of last page. So what was the lesson learned from the process? Delegate. That it takes a long time. So if you operate in a number of countries, really you need to get started early. Like I said, we really started the process in September of last year. It went full force, where we really had sort of the president's ask behind us. And we still only got to 32 additional countries being approved over those 9 months. Having the right stakeholders involved, as opposed to continuing to make other calls, we had all the people meeting on a weekly basis. We had a regularly scheduled call. We don't know. Did the long consent form lead to the high skip rates? I had people tell me anecdotally that instead of making them feel more comfortable, they felt worse because they didn't even know all the things we could do with the data that we weren't doing with it. So now they were really convinced that we were doing all of these things with the data. So it really heightened skepticism around what we do with data. Historically, the demos were in front, so the fact that they were moved to the back and people took the survey and then had the demos, maybe that resulted in the higher skip rate than when we had done previously. Also, we could have increased the communications to dispel the concerns. So we had an FAQ document. I'm more than happy to share that with anybody at any point in time as well. But how many people actually read the FAQ document? So it was sort of like the invitation to take the survey, and if you want to learn more about why we're asking certain questions, this is where you can go to find it. So it wasn't like it was like readily available, and we didn't highlight the fact anywhere that suddenly there was a new process and that we were asking for sexual orientation. I raised the issue of eliminating the consent form in countries where not legally required. Our compliance folks said no. They still are quite comfortable with this process. Something, and Sean, maybe you know the answer to this, when I was preparing the presentation, I asked the question, is consent required every time or once if it's on file?
Every part of the process that you go through is usually, but it's going to be country specific. But then also, the other part about consent is it can be withdrawn at any time.
Right.
Yeah.
But if someone consented once, because I know for years when we had done the survey previously, our vendor kept information. They had consented, to your point, to all the fields, and they only had to do it once, and as long as that was on file, they didn't have to do it every year. So I'm wondering if the same thing is in play.
That's going to tie into the other part of it, which is how long are you going to be keeping the data and how long do you need to keep the data?
Right.
And then if you remove the PII from it, you can keep it for a very indefinite period of time. But with PII, especially comments that are self-identifying perhaps, then it changes the nature of the game.
Okay. I mean, the other thing is we'd never asked for that kind of information globally before. And so a suggestion was made, if we're transitioning to Workday, if we ask for that information moving forward and say how we're going to use the information, that you might get targeted emails in the future being invited to events that might be relevant for you or interesting for you, would that have changed things? Because for many countries it came out of the blue, right? There was no setup for it. What was also interesting, and maybe not a surprise, we created skipped and not skipped as a demographic and ran the data that way. And the people that skipped, so remember, this is just of the eligible, so the 40% that skipped were in most instances 10 or more points less favorable than the people that didn't skip. And so what's interesting is when we looked at our gender gaps, is it really telling the true story? Because we're missing 40% of the population to know if they're male or female. So would the gaps have been bigger? Certainly the scores would have been lower. And that's it for me, I think.
Probably out of time.
I have a,
Sure. And apparently, thank you. So no, just really quick about where we're going. I don't think that we've seen the end of this by any extent. I think that more countries, as they look at the GDPR and they look at some other things, that's really the gold standard, like we were talking about earlier. And we're going to see more and more laws and legislation around this. Some countries are using this as kind of an economic incentive where they are saying, our data is sovereign about our people, and we don't want that data to be leaving this country at all. And so that's another thing that we're going to be seeing, having to deal with there. But in summary, if you focus on being transparent, giving them notice about how you're going to be using their data, and maintaining accountability, then that gets you 90% of the way there. And then just always work with your teams of privacy, security, and legal resources. So.
yeah, quick question. Really trying to think through the process around, you can appreciate the amount of work that went into getting this and getting these demographics added to an engagement survey. Did you guys ever consider, adding it to your HRIS as well? I think about those huge skip rates and knowing the questions that would get asked on engagement, but more broadly just on the composition of our workforce. By not asking them in both places, we don't have a system of record anymore when it comes to those questions.
Well, I think legally in the United States, what was it, like 3 or 4 years ago, there was a request for people to self-identification, to go in the system and self-ID. And we did not have high participation, to be honest. And so what our affinity groups have said, either on the disability side or the LGBTQ side, they did not feel either that we had an accurate sense of what our population looked like based on self-ID in those places. I still think, people still think there's confidentiality related to it. And so when they self-ID here, there's a difference between self-IDing here and in our HRIS system. But we would not make the decision to take that information and not have employees self-ID. It's very countercultural.
Okay. So if I could possibly try to summarize this, let me read something and see if this is right. So whether, for the countries that were colored on your slide, Sean, whether someone's doing an attributed or a non-attributed survey, we require notice, not necessarily consent. Is that accurate?
It depends upon which legal basis you're operating under.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then is it ultimately up to the controller's legal departments?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
But ultimately, it's up to the law.
Right.
Is that codified in a contract between Perceptics and us?
Yeah, and so how this would normally work in terms of launching the survey, one of the initial steps would we would be signing a data processing agreement, a DPA. And so in there it would say, who's the controller, who's the processor, how are we going to be handling this data, what legal basis are you going to be using, all the moving parts of that.
So in theory, we have that agreement. I know that we do. So our company must have said we're a consent company, and that's why I have that consent form at the beginning of my survey. Do you know?
We can look.
Okay, thank you.
And we had to share that information with all of the countries and the regulators with the countries to show that was in fact in place for your company.
And there's a lot of time bifurcation that happens when in certain countries they don't want to ask special data sets, and so you see that some countries do and don't.
So we're at an advantage because our lawyers refused to let us put the consent form on our survey. So there's hope for you if your lawyers will play that way. But we were told that email and name alone will trigger the need for consent. So we're actually going through a reconsent process right now with our international businesses so that we'll be ready to launch. And we're doing it offline. We're not doing it as part of the survey. So is that something that you could have done and alleviated all of that stress? I mean, it's not an easy process either, but it doesn't interfere with the integrity of the data that you're collecting and the.
But we didn't include email or name anywhere. Yeah, single sign-on, and then we didn't give that information to the vendor to connect it, so there's no names associated with anybody. But employee ID. But they don't have the key to know who those people are.
So do you do the distribution?
We don't. You mean of the reports to
No,
manage?
how do you send the survey out if you're not giving the email addresses to Perceptics?
There is a general communication that goes out from the CEO of the firm that says, take the survey.
So you're sending it from an internal email, okay.
Right.
Okay, so one more question. So the fact that they disagree or did not consent, you can't even take your HRIS data and append it?
No, we won't do that, but we still use their data, so we have everybody's data. We have the stuff that we sent from HRIS, but we will not send over any of the personal information that they did not consent to. We know who they report to. Right. We know what team they're a part of.
Gosh, I don't think I would be able to resist.
Great, thank you. No, I was just going to comment that we took a different route where So we are a Dutch-based company in Netherlands with heavy populations in France and Germany and the Netherlands. And in 2016 and 17, we just surveyed. Right, here's the survey. Take it, please. And, 69, 74% response rates. Last year, in response to some of this, we made a decent effort, I think, of putting in an informed consent for the whole survey, which included you gave informed consent for the data that had already been uploaded to Perceptics, right, which included the demographics and the org hierarchy, very limited demographics, nothing of this order. But you also gave consent for all of the survey responses that you gave to the quantitative and open-ended questions. There weren't any demographics on the survey itself. We saw a 3% decline, so people that would get the email from Perceptics, open the email, go into the link, look at the informed consent, and then about 3% of that population that was invited to participate bowed out at that point. Again, not knowing what the survey was going to look like after the informed consent, but it was made mandatory. You couldn't go be a voyeur and just go past the informed consent to look at the content. You had to decide then and there, given the purposes and the intent and the description of the survey content, to decide. And so we lost 552 people on a base of 17,000. And we thought, that's a great number for us, right? Where we want that 3% who don't feel comfortable to bail, and the rest then understood the parameters under which their data was going to be used.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie and Sean. We appreciate it. Thank you.